He affected 2.1 acres on his own land in cleaning up what had been a terrible disaster. Actually, everybody had kind of abused that farm because it had been leased by absentee farmers for many years. He's an engineer, and so he designed a beautiful channel through there to make sure that the water could flow, reduce sedimentation, reduce any type of chemigation going into the Bighorn River and that sort of thing. At one point, by moving 2.1 acres, by affecting 2.1 acres on his own property, he was facing penalties of $65 million because the EPA claims that they can impose penalties at that time of $37,500 a day. That has now gone up to $59,000 a day if you violate the Clean Water Act. So what they do is they come into these farmers or ranchers and they say, you violated the Clean Water Act, you're facing penalties of $59,000 a day unless you do exactly what we tell you to do. Well, obviously 2 days you're dead broke. So nobody can fight back against them. And that's the thing, is that Congress never should have given that kind of authority to a bureaucracy, because giving a bureaucracy that kind of punishment authority, they turn into dictators. And that's what they've done.
So how do we scale some of that stuff back? Because I think you're right. Most people at this point don't believe in the institutions. They feel something has gone horrifically awry. They feel like what comes out of D.C. has nothing to do with their day-to-day life, regardless of what you think of the events of January 6th specifically. I've just never met anyone in the last year who's really walking around saying this is the biggest issue of the day. But they're obsessed with this stuff to sort of keep our eye off the ball. I mean, what do you think from a constitutional perspective, a legal perspective, like what can we do actually to reverse the machine a little bit and get things back to the way the country was supposed to be run?
Well, one of the things that I've been doing since I made the decision to run for this office is I have reached out to a variety of congressional representatives in Washington, D.C. to start building those relationships and the allyships that I'm going to need to be an effective congresswoman back there. And one of the things that I've talked to them repeatedly about are what my priorities are. And my priorities are taking power out of Washington, D.C. We need to be working with our governors, our good and effective governors, the Ron DeSantis's of the world. We need to be working with our good and effective attorney generals. And we need to be doing what was intended by our foundational documents. And that is there should be very little power in Washington, D.C. So even Congress, we have got to start divesting ourselves, but we've really got to be divesting the unelected bureaucrats of the power that they have and that they have amassed. Over the last 10, 15 years, I've been traveling the country giving a speech called Regulation Without Representation. And I've been exposing what has been happening with our administrative state. And that's primarily what I've dealt with as a trial attorney. So I'm a trial attorney. I've represented a lot of landowners and business owners against the EPA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, US Forest Service, USDA, all of the alphabet agencies, if you will, fighting to protect our private property rights, fighting against their incredible government overreach, attempting to take control of our irrigation infrastructure and those sorts of things. I want to take that expertise to Washington, D.C., work with my fellow congressional representatives and find ways to substantially impact the power and reduce the power that these agencies have over the citizens of this country. It was never intended to be that way. In addition to which, there's just such an enormous waste associated with it. You know, the EPA, tens of thousands of employees, yet every single state has a Department of Environmental Quality. Why do we have tens of thousands of employees in the EPA, all of whom seem to think that their job is to punish people, rather than working with our state, our state Department of Environmental Quality? I get along great with the DEQ here in Wyoming. I'll tell you what, the EPA and I go head to head, and I've had to have trials against them and beat the dog out of them in order to keep them back from, trying to take control of my clients' properties. But why would the EPA be able to come into a Warland, Wyoming and start attempting to punish people for straightening an irrigation ditch? Yet that's what they do. We need to expose it. We need to roll it back. We need to bring that power back to the states where it belongs. But it's Congress that's going to have to act to do it.
Yeah, actually, can you explain that sort of thing a little bit further? Because I think a lot of people, they still hear the EPA, the word protections in their environment. It sort of sounds right. Okay, they must be nice people doing these things. As you said, there's now thousands and thousands of people that are part of this. But can you give me an example of what type of thing would be happening in Wyoming where, you know, someone is living their life as they see fit, whatever water rights they have or whatever other natural resource it is, and what the EPA would want to do, why they would claim they would want to do it, and then what happens when you get into a fight with them?
Well, I'll give you one example of a case that I handled up in northern Wyoming, and it was outside of Worland, where I was last week. I represented a landowner, and he moved an irrigation ditch on his property. And the EPA, and I know it was a test case, they came in and claimed that he violated the Clean Water Act by doing that because that irrigation ditch was a, quote, navigable water of the United States. It wasn't. It was an irrigation ditch. He had the right to maintain it and to move it and do what he did. It took us 6 years. They filed the enforcement action against him in 2008. We finally had a 2-week trial in 2014. I'm smart enough to know that you always get a jury trial when you're going up against the federal government for many reasons. But one is that a lot of judges anymore are federal employees. I mean, they are federal employees, and they think of themselves that way. So I had a jury, and after a 2-week jury trial, they came back and ruled in my client's favor. He affected 2.1 acres on his own land in cleaning up what had been a terrible disaster. Actually, everybody had kind of abused that farm because it had been leased by absentee farmers for many years. He took out, he's an engineer, and so he designed a beautiful channel through there to make sure that the water could flow, reduce sedimentation, reduce any type of chemigation going into the Bighorn River and that sort of thing. At one point, by moving 2.1 acres, by affecting 2.1 acres on his own property, he was facing penalties of $65 million because the EPA claims that they can impose penalties at that time of $37,500 a day. That has now gone up to $59,000 a day if you violate the Clean Water Act. So what they do is they come into these farmers or ranchers and they say, you violated the Clean Water Act, you're facing penalties of $59,000 a day unless you do exactly what we tell you to do. Well, obviously 2 days you're dead broke. So nobody can fight back against them. And that's the thing, is that Congress never should have given that kind of authority to a bureaucracy, because giving a bureaucracy that kind of punishment authority, they turn into dictators. And that's what they've done. So right now I'm handling a lawsuit. I don't know if you remember when the EPA blew out the Gold King mine in southwestern Colorado and they turned the Animas River orange. It was in 2015. You can Google it. It was one of the worst environmental disasters in our country's history. And the EPA did it. So they went in and without my client's permission or knowledge, they built a water treatment facility on his property. They've operated it for 6.5 years and never paid him a dime in rent. It's an unconstitutional takings. That's the kind of abuse that the EPA visits upon our landowners every day. What the EPA is trying to do is they'd like to take control of all water resources in this country. Well, we know what happens when the federal government takes control of anything, especially when it is a resource such as water that is absolutely necessary for life. You know what happens. We're seeing it with medical care. They're saying, okay, you don't get the vaccine, we're going to take away your job. We're going to take away your unemployment. We're going to take away your medical care. That's exactly what they're moving on, and they have been moving on with water. This is no longer any kind of a conspiracy idea. This is truly what the federal government does. One of the most horrific things that happened in this country was Obamacare, because that's when the federal government decided that they could control our decision-making by controlling our access to health care. And look at what they've done to us in the last 2 years. They want to do the same thing with water.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.